Welcome to Session 3 of Safe Travel Solutions. In this session, David will be discussing three main topics: the idea of having a contact in a crisis, information security, and how to deal with the media in a crisis. Again, we want to remind you to take notes as you go along and refer to your listening guide for extra information about these topics. We open this session with a short role play that demonstrates the idea of having an outside contact, or as we like to call it, the Bob concept.
You, woman, over here. Our reports indicate that you all have been preaching Christianity to the people of this country, and that's criminal. You're also in violation of your visas. We're going to charge you with both those offenses. Do you understand?
Sir, we're just here to do relief work. We really care about the people of your country. We just want to do whatever we can to help. That contact that I gave you earlier, if you get in touch with him, I'm sure that he can verify everything that I'm saying.
Well, we'll check out your information and we're going to start the process.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right, we've talked about a box and an STS and discussed the pressure that's on folks to stay in that box and the problem that happens when somebody wants to push beyond that and they didn't accept your transition or your alternative and they want to push beyond. So we're going to need some more techniques to try to shorter that "no, I won't tell you and you can't make me" answer. And so this next technique that we want to throw out is the calling for an outside contact. And that outside contact is somebody that we've pre-designated from your organization. We're going to discuss in a minute how you might select that person. Their name is not necessarily Bob, but for training purposes, we're going to call him Bob right here and now. Don't want you to get hung up on that and insist that you call the guy Bob when his name is Jim. But this person is going to be our lifeline if we were on that show and calling for the lifeline. I'm going to explain to you why you might need a Bob and at what times you might want to bring that Bob in. We need to discuss who your Bob would be and who would be the best Bob for your organization. We need to know the appropriate timing to bring Bob in. We don't want to encourage you that 10-minute delay in customs and you're calling for, "I want my ambassador and I want Bob and I want," because what we know will happen is you'll probably be sitting in a small room counting flies for a few hours while they're waiting on. Because there is that problem where once you invoke that "I want my ambassador" routine, sometimes they will make you wait by the law for your ambassador. So I don't want to call for Bob too soon. How do I know when? And I need to know how to bring him into the conversation in a way. I can't demand they call anybody, so I need to bring him in a way that persuades them. Here is the solution you are looking for. And it is an alternative. It's an alternative to no-win situations. We want $1 million. My other alternative would be to say, "I don't have $1 million. Go ahead and shoot me." That's the short answer, okay? So we're going to move towards a little bit more positive one. And we may need to know how to explain who Bob is. So I'll go into a little bit of detail on that. First, let's start with the why. It's just another transition to start with. It's another in-the-box thing that I transition to. And I'm transitioning to somebody safe. By safe, I mean this contact, he and I or she and I have already discussed, I may call for you in an emergency. This is a person who's safe. They're not going to give them a lot more information than I would. They're going to know my STS and they're going to be coordinated on that. It's somebody who knows their resources. If they get a tough call from a hostage taker or an unfriendly government guy, they're going to know where to go for help and things because we've talked about it ahead of time. And there's somebody who's going to help me answer questions that I don't feel safe answering. They're an excuse for me not to go into those details. A good interrogator, either by training or just by natural instinct, will push you to say, "You're the only person here who can solve this problem. You're not going home until you do this." A good interrogatee, I think I just made that word up, will push back with, "No, I'm not. I've given you everything I know. I'm not the solution, but I have one. Here it is, and it's this person. Call this Bob." Who is Bob? Who's going to be Bob for your organization? Bob needs to be somebody who's available. I wouldn't choose a Bob who's going to go into Hawaii for the 2 weeks of my short-term trip. Somebody who's going to be around. Bob should be prepared, somebody who knows my STS, knows what the group is doing, knows the circumstances of the country that we're in, and is ready to say the right things. If I'm not saying the word missionary, Bob knows I'm not saying the word missionary. If I am, Bob knows that. Who is Bob not? Historically, family members don't make a really good Bob, because a call, a life and death type call to a family member is an emotional experience, and it's really hard. And a bad guy would exploit that. When he realizes he has somebody with an emotional investment, he's going to treat you the same way he is the victim. Secondly, it shouldn't be a pastor, a board member, somebody who's perceived as the leader of the organization. Because a good Bob has this wonderful out of, let me take your demands, let me go talk to some people and see what we can do. He can't do that if he's a senior person, because there's no one to go see. He is, and I'm wanting a decision right now because you're the leader. And so a good Bob is a middleman, a middle person who can pass the buck and buy time. Historically, statistically, we know, in most of even in a 2 or 3 hour hostage situation, the longer the hostage is alive, the better the odds the hostage will remain alive. Okay? So this guy's buying us some time amongst everything else. When do I need him? I would say when you've lost your freedom, you're in a jail, or it's a bad guy, a carjacking or something gone wrong, and you're just not free to leave, and it's not ending like it should have. I mean, it's one thing to be detained for a few minutes in customs for some questions. It's another for it to take me to the back room and I'm sitting for 8 hours. So that's when I start to think about maybe I need some other options here. You know what? I've answered your questions. That didn't work for you. Let's get this guy. Can you call this guy? And maybe he can answer your questions so I can move on and go on home or go on my journey. Whenever it appears that this thing's not going to end without outside intervention, I'd be considering calling Bob. There are other examples. We had a short-term team held in a former Soviet country here just last year. They felt it was important to make that Bob call early on just for the accountability. They wanted the policemen who were not playing by the rules to know that somebody else knew where they were. They needed to know in their own heart, somebody knows where to come looking for me. It just gave them the courage to keep going. So I might want to do that just as a bit of a accountability factor. Make sure that my Bob knows when I can. And whenever the guy's demanding information that I can't give, he's got an incentive to call Bob. Sir, I can't give you money. You have my wallet. I can give you a name of a guy who will work something out. Big confusion, particularly for Americans. We even get the misperception that the U.S. government will not talk to terrorists. We don't negotiate. That is not U.S. policy. Policy is we don't pay ransom. We do talk. And humanitarian aid, food, lots of things have been traded to get people back. Deals are made, they just don't involve weapons and cash and things like that. So I'm not going to talk to the guy about that. I'm going to pass him off to my Bob. I'm going to do that. I'm going to persuade him that Bob is the only person who can help out here because they've exhausted my resources. I've answered their questions for them. Bob is a safe place to really pass the buck, and that's really what I'm doing. I'm being kept up 24 hours a day maybe. I dealt with a case last year in a country that most of us would consider a tourist destination. Simple tactic, they simply took the guy in and they kept him up for 23.5 hours of interrogation. Most of us will say things we wished we hadn't after about 14, because you can't even remember what you said in the first hour. So that's a good time to be calling for Bob, because Bob's sleeping, Bob's safe, Bob has resources, he's got counsel, he's got access to other things. Okay? So Bob's a good person to end a stalemate type of a situation. I may need to explain my relationship to Bob. Why should we call this guy that you're asking us to call? We just want to talk to you or your mother. And so I need to explain. If I'm in a closed country, a country that doesn't welcome missionaries or whatever I am there doing, I may need to just say to the guy, call this Bob, he's a friend that would help, or he's my employer, or I may have some other relationship. In an open country where I could be a missionary, I would just say, this is a guy from my church, he said he would help out if there was a crisis, call him and he can start to help you find answers so I can go home. And so I would think that through and I would talk to Bob ahead of time about it. And I'd make sure Bob's prepared. Bob should know my STS. He should have it down. And if there's a team, he should make sure he knows everybody's and how we're coordinating so he doesn't undo whatever I've done. You know, I don't want to, I spend all this time talking about I'm a former school teacher. I'm just here helping teach literacy because, you know, I love your people and I want to help out. And then I give them a Bob who calls up and goes, you know, you got to let him go. He used to work for the government and I don't need Bob helping me out in that way. So you want to think about that. I need somebody who will relay information accurately. When they call Bob and he's through with this phone call, if they've made ransom demands or we're going to call back at 12 o'clock and this guy's going to be charged criminally if you don't do this, I need to know that Bob's thorough and accurate enough that he'll hang up and take that information to the right place. The FBI, the church leadership, other resources, okay? And Bob needs to know, whoever my contact is, that this is not some life and death job you're just asking him to do with no preparation. You prep him ahead of time, and then you give him some resources. Bob can always call the faith-based organization that's hosting your team. You've always got that option. Bob could, and probably should have that number in his book and be ready. If this thing gets a little beyond me, I'm going to call the hosting group because they have people trained to do this sort of thing. And then there's groups like Fort Sherman and companies like us who do consulting and help people in crises like that. Bob should have those numbers and those names and things figured out ahead of time. We're not asking the average citizen to take on an impossible job where they might get you killed. You're asking somebody to be responsible. The odds of them even being needed are slim, but we're doing it ahead of time, not after we're sitting in a jail cell and wishing we'd coordinated, or while someone's listening in while I make the phone call. Hey, I'm asking them to talk to you because if they talk to Mom, you know, they're going to find out I used to be in the top secret. I don't want to do that on that phone. And I'm joking, and that conversation's happened in the last 3 years. Okay? And then they were flabbergasted that they were overheard because that would be a violation of privacy in America, and that was standard operating procedure there. So that's what the whole outside contact thing's all about.
You've just heard David talk about the significance of having an outside contact in a crisis situation. Establishing your Bob before you go on a trip is extremely important. As a team, talk about who would be a good candidate for your Bob. Also, we've provided a learning activity that will help you practice using your STS and staying in your box. Take time with your team to participate and look for opportunities to ask for your Bob and think through how you would react. The more you think through these skills and put them into practice, the more comfortable you will be using them on your trip.